The world's longest desert highway has started operation in Inner Mongolia, North China.
But the exploration continues in China. Researchers are placing a new biodegradable hydrogel into the soil.
A surprising report has been coming from northern China that engineers have been cutting into the desert itself and moving sand on a scale no one had tried before. In only 12 months, nearly 1 billion tons of sand disappeared from places that had been barren for generations. No one knew what exactly would happen next, only that China had started one of the boldest environmental experiments on Earth. And what happened just 1 year later is truly what left engineers shocked. A nation on the edge of the desert crisis. No one expected. Northern China was standing at a breaking point. Entire provinces were watching fertile soil turn into dry sand, and more than 1/4 of the whole country had already shifted into desert terrain. Villages that once grew wheat and corn now sat half-buried, with cracked earth stretching in every direction. Families who lived on this land for generations packed what they could carry and walked away, because the desert kept swallowing everything behind them. What made it worse was that this crisis did not happen overnight. It was built slowly, year after year. Large sections of forest had been cut down during the early industrial years, and heavy grazing by livestock left the ground bare. With no trees and no deep roots, the soil lost its strength. Strong northern winds scraped off the top layers of earth until nothing was left but loose sand. By the time the country reached 1949, forest cover had dropped to only 8%. This meant the land was wide open to the elements, and every storm carried away more of it. The Gobi Desert saw this weakness and moved in.
The desert is the Gobi, the fourth largest on this planet. It's already consumed villages.
Dune fields crept southward, taking over land that once supported villages, farms, and small towns. Farmers struggled as crops failed. Water became scarce because major rivers were diverted in many directions to support fast-growing cities and heavy agriculture. In some years, long sections of the Yellow River dried up completely for months, something that had not happened in earlier centuries. Each spring, something even more alarming arrived. Huge dust storms rolled across northern China like advancing walls. They rose thousands of feet into the air and carried fine sand all the way to Beijing, turning the sky orange and making the air difficult to breathe. Planes were grounded, highways shut down, and cities disappeared under a layer of haze. The storms did not stop at the coastline. They drifted over the sea and reached Japan, South Korea, and even parts of Russia. Scientists studied the data and grew more worried. Every model showed the same pattern. If the desert kept moving south at its current speed, large population centers could soon be at risk. Farmland would shrink, food production would suffer, and millions of people could be displaced. It was no longer just an environmental concern. It threatened the social and economic stability of the entire region. This was the moment when China realized that the situation needed action on a scale the world had rarely seen. Officials, engineers, and environmental experts gathered to design something vast enough to stop the desert and give northern China a fighting chance. They wanted a solution that would not only halt the sand, but push it back and reclaim land that had been lost. This decision launched one of the most ambitious environmental projects in human history, a project many believed could never succeed. Digging to building a living wall, the Great Green Wall takes shape. China understood that stopping the desert would require more than emergency measures. Before the idea of removing 1 billion tons of sand even entered the national plan, the country tried to create a living shield that could push back the advancing dunes. In 1978, officials launched the 3 North Shelter Forest Program. Many called it the Great Green Wall because its purpose was simple to describe but incredibly difficult to build. They wanted to plant a massive band of forests across northern China, stretching thousands of miles to block the Gobi Desert from moving south. The challenge was harsh. The land chosen for this project suffered from extreme temperature swings. Winters dropped into deep cold, and summers reached intense heat that dried everything in sight. Strong winds blew across the plains with enough force to uproot young trees and bury entire fields under shifting sand. The soil held almost no moisture, And in many places, rainfall was so rare that new plants died within days. Planting a forest here was like trying to grow a garden on the surface of the moon. Scientists and engineers refused to give up. They designed one of the most important tools of the entire project. It was a slow-release drip irrigation system buried beneath the sand. Instead of spraying water from above, which would evaporate quickly, these hidden tubes released moisture directly into the soil around the roots. Each drop counted. With this system, seedlings could survive long enough to develop deeper roots. Another method became famous across the world. Workers created straw checkerboard grids, a technique passed down through generations in desert communities. They dug small trenches in the sand and placed straw in a square pattern. These grids trapped wind, slowed drifting dunes, and gave seedlings a stable place to grow. Without the checkerboards, most saplings would have been blown away long before they matured. Choosing the right trees was equally important. Saxaul trees, known for surviving in dry wastelands, became one of the primary species. They could remain alive with little water. Red willow added flexibility because it grew quickly and provided strong root support. Then there was the desert poplar. This tree had roots that could travel almost 90 feet into the ground, reaching deep layers of hidden moisture. These species were not chosen for beauty. They were chosen because they could survive in a place where almost nothing else could live. Year by year, the Great Green Wall expanded.
What is the Great Green Wall Project? And how does this project affect other parts of the world?
Workers planted millions of trees, sometimes by hand and sometimes with aerial seeding. By 2009, the project covered more than 193,000 square miles. It created one of the largest human-made forests on Earth. By the 2022, results finally appeared in global satellite images. The Gobi Desert, once known for steady expansion, began to shrink by hundreds of square miles every year.
The Gobi Desert is a vast desert region located in East Asia, covering parts of northern and northwestern China and southern Mongolia.
It was the first clear sign that the desert could be pushed back. For scientists, this was a historic moment. A desert that had threatened the country for generations was reversing course. It proved that large-scale environmental engineering could succeed when supported with enough time, planning, and effort. But the fight did not end at the borders of the Gobi. China soon faced an even larger, harsher stretch of sand that demanded new solutions. This was the time to dig up tons of sand. The Taklamakan Greenbelt, holding back the Sea of Death. The Taklamakan Desert sits in the heart of Xinjiang, and people call it the Sea of Death for a reason. Its dunes rise like moving mountains, shifting with every strong wind. Some dunes reach hundreds of feet high. Entire roads vanish if crews stop clearing sand for even a short while, and dig they did. For many years, towns around the Taklamakan lived in fear of being swallowed bit by bit, and sandstorms rolled in without warning and buried farmland, homes, and sections of highways.
Hotan is the most significant city and located on the borders of the Taklamakan Desert.
Initially, the short-term solution was a massive and relentless excavation effort. Authorities mobilized a small army of heavy machinery in the form of bulldozers, dump trucks, and excavators to physically remove the sand that encroached on vital infrastructure. They constantly cleared major roads, railways, and irrigation canals, sometimes digging up millions of tons of sand annually just to keep them operational. This was a continuous Sisyphean task because as soon as a section was cleared, the next strong wind would begin to cover it again, necessitating a never-ending cycle of expensive and resource-intensive digging. Soon, China knew that digging up tons of sand would not be enough here. To protect nearby towns, engineers planned a long green belt that wrapped around the desert like a protective ring. This belt stretched more than 1,700 miles. Instead of using only tall trees, they built a layered system of shrubs, grasses, and hardy trees arranged in long strips. These strips broke the force of the wind and slowed the movement of the sand dunes. The shrubs held the top layer of sand. The grasses spread their roots outward to help lock the soil. The tougher trees stood as barriers that caused the wind to lose strength before it reached the towns. Rainfall in the Taklamakan is almost zero, so surviving here requires careful planning.
The Taklamakan is a vast shifting desert, stretches 1,000 kilometers from east to west.
Workers laid out irrigation pipes that ran underground. Sensors tracked soil moisture so that water was released slowly and only when needed. This system reduced waste and kept the plants alive long enough for their roots to anchor firmly into the dunes. In some sections, crews dug trenches to guide water where it would not evaporate under the sun. These trenches also allowed roots to reach deeper layers of moisture. The presence of plants changed the behavior of the dunes. Instead of rolling forward like waves, many dunes began to settle around the new roots. Once the top layers stopped drifting, the deeper layers started to compact. This made it easier for workers to dig up sand in controlled areas without causing sudden collapses. The sand collected from these zones was moved for industrial use, construction work, and large land restoration projects. Over the years, this steady removal created narrow pathways and pockets of cleared land that formed the foundation for small farms. Local communities soon discovered that the stabilized soil was useful for growing certain herbal plants. One of the most valuable was cistanche, a traditional medicinal herb. People learned to cultivate it in the newly secured stretches of land. This crop brought income to families who once struggled against the spreading desert. At the same time, fire-resistant woods grown in the region supported local industries. Families began earning money from processing the wood into products used across the country. What began as a defensive line slowly turned into a source of hope for thousands of people. The sand that once pushed them back now provided work, stability, and food. The green belt stood as a sign that even a place known as the Sea of Death could be held in place, one planted strip at a time. Yet while China tries to fight sand in the west, another unexpected crisis forms in the east. How sand hunger created a new disaster. As China grew into a modern industrial nation, its appetite for sand became enormous. Every new road, railway, port, and skyscraper needed concrete, and concrete depends on the right kind of sand. Builders discovered long ago that desert sand could not be used. The grains were too smooth because thousands of years of wind had polished them. Smooth grains do not lock together well, so concrete made from them becomes weak and breaks easily. This pushed China toward rivers and lakes where the sand grains were rough and jagged enough to bind tightly with cement. Engineers call this growing need for construction materials sand hunger. It created an intense market that encouraged thousands of dredging crews to search for the most profitable sites. Lake Poyang, the largest freshwater lake in China, became one of the main targets. The lake connects to the Yangtze River and holds large deposits of natural sand that settled there over centuries. Dredging ships began to gather around the lake, sometimes in huge clusters. Many of these ships stayed in one place for days, lowering long pipes into the lakebed to pull out sand mixed with water. The dredging process was simple but very powerful. Each ship used a suction pump strong enough to lift tons of sand every hour. A steel pipe, sometimes more than 100 feet long, reached down to the lakebed. When the pump started, the pipe dragged across the bottom and vacuumed up whatever it touched. The mixture of sand and water traveled through the pipe and emptied into sorting units on the ship. Screens separated the sand from the water. Clean water flowed back into the lake while piles of fresh sand collected inside the ship's storage compartments. After filling up, these ships carried the sand to construction companies along the Yangtze and the surrounding provinces. Over time, this constant suction created deep channels at the bottom of the lake. Flat areas became pits. Shallow regions became trenches. Water levels began to drop by more than a quarter, and the lake no longer behaved the way it once did. Fish breeding zones collapsed because their nesting grounds were gone. The paths where fish swam each season were torn apart by shifting pits and steep edges created by dredging pipes. Local fishermen reported catching far fewer fish than before. Some fish populations dropped so sharply that entire communities had to rethink their main source of income. Migratory birds also suffered greatly. Lake Poyang provided feeding grounds for species that traveled long distances across Asia. These birds relied on mudflats and shallow water where they could rest and find food. As dredging carved out deeper areas, the mudflats disappeared. Some reports estimated that bird numbers fell by nearly 90%. Even rare species that depended on the lake for survival struggled to adapt. The dredged-out lakebed caused another problem. With so much sand removed, the lake's natural shape changed. Floodwaters from the Yangtze now rushed through the region faster instead of spreading gently into the lake. Water moved downstream with greater force, raising flood risks for millions of people. Areas that were once safe during heavy rains began to experience sudden rises in water levels. Engineers warned that these new patterns were a direct result of altering the lakebed. Sand hunger had created a silent chain reaction. Removing sand in huge amounts solved construction needs, but opened up a new crisis beneath the water's surface. Ecosystems weakened. Bird migrations collapsed. Flood dangers grew. What seemed like an easy way to supply the nation with building material became a growing environmental disaster. Yet while this new crisis unfolds, China is bent on fixing its original problem of sand in the desert. Engineering in the sands, megastructures built in hostile terrain. To build the Taklamakan Desert Highway in a desert with sand that never stays still, engineers first had to clear, reshape, and control the sand itself. The process began with heavy machines that scraped away unstable layers. Excavators, bulldozers, and front loaders dug up immense volumes of sand and pushed them aside to create level ground. In many stretches, workers removed dune peaks entirely. This involved cutting deep channels into the dunes, scooping out sand in repeated layers, and transporting it to safer holding zones. Over the years, this work added up to hundreds of millions of tons of relocated sand. Some of this sand was moved for stabilization, some was reshaped into smoother slopes, and some was collected as controlled mining material for industrial use. By removing the highest dune layers and flattening sharp rises, engineers created long, wide corridors strong enough to support road foundations. These cleared paths opened as new strips of land that had been buried under sand for decades. Once the top layers were dug out, workers covered the exposed ground with gravel anchors and protective fabrics to hold it in place. The Taklamakan Desert Highway became one of the most famous projects built using these methods.
The world's longest desert highway has started operation in Inner Mongolia of North China.
The road stretches across one of the most unstable dune fields on Earth. Below the surface, engineers laid thick layers of compacted gravel to stop sand from flowing back under the pavement. In many parts, they dug trenches along both sides of the highway, pulling out drifting sand before it reached the road. Pumps and vacuum trucks helped speed up the removal. Some sections required constant clearing, and crews dug up fresh sand daily to prevent piles from blocking traffic. Farther east, another achievement took shape. The Lint Railway, more than 430 miles long, had to cross empty desert where dunes could swallow tracks entirely. To solve this, builders raised the railway above ground using 180 bridges. Each bridge acted like a barrier that reduced contact with shifting sand. Before building these structures, workers removed more sand to create solid platforms for support pillars. They used deep drilling rigs to anchor the pillars into compact layers beneath the loose surface. Every pillar required trenches that were cleared, dug deeper, and packed again to handle the desert's constant movement. Maintenance teams now patrol both the highway and the railway every day. They use front loaders and sand plows to dig up fresh sand dunes forming around the edges. Heat also damages surfaces, so workers regularly inspect for cracks and weak points. These teams often remove thousands of tons of new sand each month just to keep the routes open. Both projects combine engineering with vegetation. Along the edges of roads and rails, workers planted hardy shrubs to stabilize the land. The roots grip soil, slow wind, and reduce the amount of sand blowing toward the structures. And as China reshapes its deserts by digging up sand, the shocking results are already showing in just 1 year. The one-year shock. What removing 1 billion tons of sand actually changed. The first year delivered results that surprised even the teams working on the project. Through stabilization work, dune removal, land reshaping, and controlled mining for industrial use, China had relocated roughly 1 billion tons of desert sand. This was not simply pushed aside. Much of it was dug out, moved, compacted, or repurposed in ways that opened stretches of land buried for decades. Old farming zones, long trapped under moving dunes, became visible again as the upper layers were peeled away. In some areas, villagers who had once abandoned fields could now walk through places that had been unreachable for years. Satellite maps from research groups offered clear proof. In parts of Inner Mongolia, the dunes that once swept forward at a steady pace slowed dramatically. Measured retreat reached between 260 and 300 feet in the first year. These shifting giants did not disappear, but their progress weakened. Regions previously labeled as high-risk encroachment zones moved into the stable category. This meant that homes, roads, and farmlands were no longer in immediate danger of being swallowed. Air quality also began to show signs of improvement. Dust storms often start when loose sand is lifted by strong winds. With so much sand removed or stabilized, fewer loose particles drifted into the air. In some towns, local monitoring stations recorded a drop of up to 18% in airborne particulates during the dustiest months.
But the exploration continues in China. Researchers are placing a new biodegradable hydrogel into the soil.
Residents reported clearer skies and fewer days where sunlight turned orange behind thick dust. Soil engineers made another surprising discovery. After sand was cleared and the ground was treated with binding agents, the newly exposed soil held moisture far better than expected. Early measurements showed a 20 to 30% rise in moisture levels. This helped hardy grasses and shrubs survive their first months, which is often the hardest stage in desert planting. Once roots took hold, each patch of vegetation became a small barrier that slowed the wind and reduced further sand movement. Infrastructure gained benefits too. More than 1,500 miles of rural roads and small farm access paths were uncovered or restored. These routes had been blocked or buried by drifting dunes, forcing farmers to take long detours that cost time and fuel. With the roads cleared, transport became easier and cheaper. Goods that once required long trips around sand-covered areas could move directly again. Signs of wildlife return added another layer of success. As vegetation began to spread, insects settled into the new green patches. Small mammals like jerboas and desert hares soon followed. Bird surveys counted increased movement around these recovering areas, especially near early grass zones. There was also an unexpected economic effect. The demand for construction sand in nearby provinces dropped slightly. Engineers realized that some of the removed desert sand could be used in industrial processes that did not require sharp grains. This meant fewer dredging ships were needed on stressed lakes and rivers. In places already damaged by over-extraction, this small drop in pressure helped local ecosystems recover a little faster. With these early results already visible, China now looks toward even larger ecological goals, as the sand it has dug has cleared the path for the world's biggest planned green expansion by 2050. The road to 2050. The harsh Gobi Desert now receives strong sunlight for most of the year. This makes it ideal for solar thermal power. One large project uses a tall solar tower surrounded by thousands of mirrors. These mirrors turn throughout the day to reflect sunlight toward a single receiver at the top of the tower.
4 weeks, we've got to get hot salt into the system, and the hot salt will allow us to produce that superheated steam we need.
The heat collected is intense enough to melt special salt stored in insulated tanks. The melted salt holds heat for many hours, and even after the sun goes down, the stored heat is released to create steam that spins turbines. This provides electricity long after daylight ends. None of this would have been possible without earlier sand removal, because much of the foundation work required stable, compacted ground. In the Kabuki Desert, solar panels now stretch across the sand in the shape of a running horse. The design looks striking from above, but the real benefits are found on the ground. This single solar farm offsets more than 1 million tons of carbon dioxide each year. The panels also shield the soil beneath them.
Solar panels are about cutting carbon, but here in Inner Mongolia, it's also about cutting wind.
They block strong winds and trap moisture, which helps vegetation grow. Plants that once struggled to survive in open dunes now take root under the shade of the panels. These green patches are a direct result of the cleared and stabilized sand zones created during earlier land reshaping. Many desert regions that were seen as lifeless are now producing electricity and supporting plant life at the same time. The billions of tons of removed sand exposed soils that could hold binding agents, grasses, and shrubs. Once stabilized, these areas became suitable for large clean energy projects. Looking ahead, China is planning even larger steps. By 2050, the goal is to build a continuous green ring around the northern deserts. This long belt would add roughly 137,000 square miles of new forest and vegetation across some of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Without the massive sand removal groundwork already completed, such a plan would have been impossible. The cleared areas now form corridors where planting teams can work safely and effectively.
Insignificant against the vast desert, but researchers are testing more than just survival.
Local communities are expected to gain new farmland, cleaner air, and stronger protection from dust storms. If the project succeeds, China could create the largest human-made ecological shield on the planet. Thank you for staying with us to the end. Kindly subscribe to the channel for more amazing videos.